Racist cop intimidates elderly black man, not realizing chief witnesses at all. An old black man named Henry Thompson sat silently on an Oakwood Park seat. Park enjoying the warmth of his coffee, he considered his sanctuary where he may find. He could consider life and savor the tranquilly of the morning, his newspaper neatly laid across his lap. Henry's everyday friend birds quietly chirped in the trees, and the air smelled fresh from dew. At this age, aged hands marked by years of hard labor and expertise clutched his coffee cup with a calmness. Had discovered the art of savoring the most basic events in life as the sun created a golden glow across the woods. Over the park, joggers and dog walkers started to occupy the gradually sluggish routes of the park. Having spent more than 30 years in this area, Henry had grown to know Oakwood Park. Against the backdrop of his morning ritual, he was well known here as a calm person radiating dignity and compassion. His, though slightly bent by age, stance exuded the power of someone who had lived a whole life people greeted him as. On this morning, they passed with friendly smiles and polite nods. Something felt odd as Henry opened the page of his newspaper and saw a guy walking toward in the distance. It was a young police officer, headed toward with intent, wearing his uniform. Clear his walk, Henry had seen cops at the park earlier, but something about this man's manner made the officer on edge and focused his gaze upon him with a force that made. There was a sense of authority as Henry paused. Officer Mitchell moved straight toward him without thinking twice in his approach, but it was more of suspicion than protection. Henry dropped his newspaper, meeting the officer's eyes. He had lived long enough. This cop was not here for niceties. Good morning. He could see the signals of disaster. Though he could sense the tension rising, Mitchell didn't reciprocate the welcome. Henry said cordially. Instead, he paused a few feet away, crossed his arms, and asked, his tone, "What are you doing here?" Sharp, almost accusing. Henry blinked in surprise. "Just savoring my coffee and reading the paper. I visit here every morning." The officer's eyes narrowed and his voice became suspicious. "Do you live nearby?" "This is a residential area and I haven't seen you before." Henry wrinkled his eyebrows, slightly perplexed by the animosity. "Indeed, officer. I have spent more than 3 decades living just a few blocks away on." Officer Daniel from Maple Street started to have even more stiff stance and eyes studied Henry as though he were looking for something out of place. "Do you have any evidence of that?" asked, his tone slanted with uncertainty, since Henry felt the same. "But I had never seen you in this park before." Familiar pressure in his chest, not resulting from his heart issue, but from the weight of the circumstances he had come upon this kind of inquiry prior to story 1. He hoped he wouldn't have to go through in his older years, and took a "I've been visiting this park every morning for years. I do not carry evidence of." Deep breath, keeping his voice firm. "House with me when I come to savor my morning." Daniel's lips curved into a small sneer. "Well, if you cannot prove you live here, then..." Henry felt the sting of the words hanging in the air, heavy and unpleasant. Officer's mistrust and quick flash of wrath inside him, but years of experience had taught him to stay cool. He had personally experienced considerably more difficult circumstances in his lifetime. "Officer." Henry started his speech softly but forcefully. "This is a public park where I live. I have every right to be here." Mitchell moved his hand a little bit, leaning on his holster, a subdued but clear act of intimidation. I suggested you should go along." Henry's heart raced. "You have time for this." From terror, but from the annoyance of being regarded like a criminal in his own neighborhood, he meticulously folded his newspaper, placing it aside on the bench. His hands, steady yet little tired, rested on his cane. The peaceful morning he had imagined vision was becoming something quite different, and the weight of the officer's comments. "Mitchell, I'm not going away," Henry remarked, his voice really stuck strongly on his mind. Full of quiet strength. "I am seated here in a public area like everyone else in this park. I have done nothing wrong." The strain between them became evident, thickening the surrounding air. Officer Daniel's cheeks reddened with annoyance. He stepped forward even another step, his presence hovering over Henry. "The first advises you to depart. Old guy, don't make me arrest you." Daniel, his voice now carries a faintly veiled threat. Henry felt a tremor in his hand as he tightened his cane. Years of experiencing such events had equipped him yet. It never got easier. He stayed seated with his back straight, refusing to be scared. "I won't be bullied," he muttered, staring straight into Daniel's eyes. "Should you insist on carrying on this, I will be requesting to see the face of your superior." Daniel twisted in rage and won. Quick action, he reached out and grabbed Henry's arm, dragging him up from the bench with more force than required. "You are under arrest for trespassing and running from an officer," Mitchell yelled. Henry moaned as his cane's grasp tightened and agony tore across his shoulder. Staggered to the ground and battled to maintain his equilibrium, wheezed. "The tension aggravating his rough state makes me not resistible." As the confrontation peaked, another figure in the park had been attentively observing both Henry and Officer Mitchell. Noticed a man still on a nearby bench whose keen eyes captured every element of the scenario. His stance was slack, but he had a subdued passion in his way. He noted the man's expressionless showing of no feeling. As he observed Officer Mitchell keep handling Henry, his tone grew more hostile and his motions more powerful. The hand tightened around the bench's edge, his muscles tensing. He sat waiting, observing as the circumstances grew more dire with every second. Tension built. Henry, hardly able to catch his breath as his body shook. Under the pressure of the circumstances, Mitchell, dazzled by his own power, seemed blind to the man who was observing from behind a person who would shortly become well known in a manner that would fundamentally alter everything. And in that, the enigmatic figure eventually decided it was moment as Officer Mitchell got ready to put Henry in handcuffs. Officer Mitchell's tolerance was running thin, and it was clear. His posture changed to become more forceful with every second, as though every word Henry spoke was front stage. Using his authority, his hand rested on his holster, a silent but obvious threat that gave a clear message. Compliance was not a recommendation. His eyes pointed at Henry, looking for reason, any justification to let the matter go more out of control. The calm morning had evolved into a stalemate devoid of any indication of de-escalation. "I am giving you one final chance, old man," Mitchell cautioned, his voice full of irritation. "If you couldn't prove you live here, I advise you to go right now." Henry gazed up at the officer. His face reflected a mix of uncertainty and incredulity. Having spent decades living in this society helped create the very park they were standing in, the imagined need to justify his existence in an area he had lived in most of his life was ridiculous. He could feel his irritation growing in him, but he held his voice steady. "Officer, I have already told you I lived a few blocks away. Here is my house. I don't have to prove anything. Anything to you." Mitchell, clearly unsatisfied. "Do you believe this? If you don't belong right now, show me evidence. Else, you're only going to sit about here. Have an issue." His body language radiating more hostile, his stance got antagonism. The matter was on the brink of, with Mitchell ready to intensify matters at any moment. Henry, still seated on the bench, could feel his heart racing. He had gone through enough in his life to understand how these, though he knew he wouldn't be backing down, not here, circumstances could go. "But, officer, today, I come here every morning and am not causing any problems. Everyone who passes will tell you this park is as much mine as it is anyone else's." Yet his statements appeared to imply fell on deaf ears. Mitchell moved closer, the tension between them rising with every breath. The officer's hand stayed on his holster, his eyes narrowed to make it quite evident that Mitchell had already decided that Henry didn't belong, and that would be sufficient to excuse him. What then happened without notice? Mitchell moved forward, taking Henry by the Mitchell hissed, yanking Henry up from the bench, arm with a force that shocked him. "With me," Henry gasped, his body jerking under the sudden force his cane applied. Scattered to the ground as he battled to keep on his feet, the acute agony in his shoulders sent a tsunami of discomfort across his body. His heart, already hammering from the tension of the confrontation, seemed to beat quicker as, protesting the abrupt increase. He could feel the usual tightness in his chest, a warning indicator he had learned to know. See all too well throughout the years. His breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to calm himself. Henry managed to speak with strained voice. "I'm not resisting. There's no need for this. I simply need a moment. Heart condition. Mitchell ignored him and dragged Henry toward the police car, his hold relentless. Save it. The officer mumbled, his eyes fixed ahead. You need to have done. The scene seemed almost strange. The once quiet park suddenly seemed to be the background for something far more sinister. The casual passers-by who moments earlier had nodded and grinned at Henry. Now, a few joggers slowed their pace in shocked quiet. Not sure what was occurring, but knew something wasn't right. Henry's legs felt weak under him as he battled to sustain Daniel's quick pace. His body was failing him, and he knew his heart strain was getting more severe, and every stride seemed like a mountain. However, despite the physical, though Henry was starting to feel afraid, he refused to let himself be embarrassed and dug his feet into the ground, halting his forward movement as best he could. He spoke. Horror but resolved. I won't be treated like way. I have done nothing wrong, and I won't be harassed out of a public area. Daniel halted his. He snapped, tightening his face, flushing with wrath. You do not follow here. Hold on to Henry's arm. I will make sure you cease resisting right now. Regret it. Yet, Henry kept his ground despite his physical frailty and looked Mitchell straight in the eye, my own gaze relentless. I have lived my life fighting for what's right, he continued softly but deliberately, and I'm not about to halt now. If you persist on arresting me, Daniels will have to be answered for. Face twisted with wrath, he yanked harder on Henry's arm, but he didn't move. The officer's annoyance was boiling over, and it was obvious he was about to lose control. The danger of violence permeated the atmosphere, and everyone who observed could feel the moment teetering on the brink as the struggle between the two men. The enigmatic man on the adjacent bench stayed still and watched everything. His eyes had never left the scene, and when Daniel's behavior changed, his keen focus grew more hostile. The figure's posture changed slightly, as though ready to step in at any moment. The figures, now entirely focused on Officer Mitchell, observing his every movement, noting his every word. There was something in the manner the cop handled the matter, his obvious disrespect for Henry's cool head. His seeming escalation of events without purpose set something in motion in the observer's. Hands tightened around his muscles, tensing at the bench's edge. He stayed sat for the time being. This was not the first time the observer had seen a scenario like this, yet something about this specific moment seemed different. Perhaps it was the Henry maintained his dignity despite his obvious physical weakness. Maybe it was the manner he kept his ground. Whatever it was, Daniel seemed utterly unaware of the wider consequences of his activities. The observer understood that Mitchell's reaching for his shackles. The observer's jaw was rapidly running out of silence. Time clenched. He could see where this was leading, and the police had over the line, and it wasn't good. Was time for someone to intervene before things grew worse? Officer Mitchell was reaching for his handcuffs aggressively, preparing to silence Henry. A strong voice sliced through the suspense, stopping him in his tracks. Songs that sufficiently matched Officer Mitchell's deep, steady voice to carry a. Mitchell and Henry turned towards the source, weight of authority demanding quick attention. Startled by the unexpected interruption coming from the park shadows came a tall, commanding man, Chief Raymond Mitchell. The instant he moved forward, the mood changed. Chief Mitchell, a respected community leader, was well known for his cool head and rigorous attitude to law enforcement. His presence alone demanded respect, and at that moment the growing crisis came to stop. Daniel's hold on Henry's arm released, his face flushing. The audience that had started to assemble watched with bated breath as he registered who was now before him. Knowing that the atmosphere had changed totally, Chief Mitchell looked sharp and relentless, moved straight towards the two guys. Henry's eyes locked. Henry's first a quiet acknowledgement of the elder man's dignity, then turned to Mitchell, clearly disturbed now. Release him, Mitchell directed, his voice with no indication of doubt. Mitchell, caught off guard, let go of Henry's arm, almost reflexively stepping back a few paces. The change in force was evident, and the once aggressive policeman now froze, not knowing what to do. Henry seemed clearly shaken by the incident, yet he stayed calm for a period. His respiration remained weighty from the tension of the confrontation, but with the weight of what had just happened hovering in the air. The horror of what might have transpired started to fade with Chief Mitchell's presence. thereby negating his commanding presence had calmed the immediate threat, but Daniel's actions had far from finished effects. Mitchell, who had minutes previously been brash, now he was trying to keep his cool. His face was white, and beads of perspiration showed up on his forehead. The truth of the matter was rapidly sinking, and he realized he had crossed a line, and now there before him was the man. Chief Mitchell's voice was calm but forceful, someone who could either make or ruin his career. He addressed the young officer. "Do you know what you have done here?" Though the inquiry was more rhetorical than anything else, Mitchell, unable to match the chief's stare, looked down at the ground as earlier hostility had vanished to be replaced by the clear fear of censure. He opened his lips to say, but Mitchell waited for a word to emerge. "Reply this man," he kept pointing towards Henry, "a pillar of this neighborhood. He's lived in today more than you've worn that outfit. Your treatment of him was only disrespectful." His words were cutting yet managed the audience, now more sizable, silent as the power dynamic between the two cops gently moved Mitchell's weight of the chief's criticism down on him. "Sir," Mitchell started, but Mitchell interrupted him there without a justification. He said, his voice softening, "You elevated a situation that never should have been a concern initially. This is a public park. Mr. Thompson is quite entitled to be here instead of safeguarding." Daniel devoured one of the most esteemed men in this community as the people you pledged to serve harassed him hard, his hands twitching at his sides. Henry, still startled, stood erect next to the chief, his peaceful dignity in contrast to the officer's nervous behavior he lacked. Having to speak, his presence alone emphasizes the seriousness of the circumstances. He had to deal with several injustices in his life. Even in times like these, he knew when to be strong and when to let others fight the war on his behalf. His eyes locked Mitchell's, and for a fleeting instant the two men, one born years ago, had a shared knowledge. Upon seeing the long grind of development in the struggle for equality, Chief Mitchell switched his focus back to Mitchell's emotion. "Relentless, you have seriously misidentified, officer, and there will be consequences tormenting someone in this community, particularly someone like Mr. Thompson is not only rude, you should be a professional defender of this community, not a threat." Every word hit Mitchell like a hammer, his face increasing rare with every sentence. The young cop, now totally aware of the gravity of his actions, could do little except nod. His eyes remained locked on the ground. "I'm sorry, Sir," Mitchell said, though his voice little above a whisper. The apology arrived too late to turn things around. Chief Mitchell nodded once to acknowledge the words, but showed no indication of forgiveness. "Mr. Thompson," queried, his tone now turning back towards Henry. Chief Mitchell's voice softened. "Are you all right?" Henry nodded, clearly aware that the tension of the circumstances had worn him out. "I will be fine," Henry answered, his voice firm but fatigued. "I just didn't expect it to be treated this way in my own area." The chief's demeanor got serious. "You shouldn't have been," he said, "and I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen once again. Not here, not in this community." Mitchell stopped briefly to observe the situation, the bystanders still silent, observing every event. His eyes went back to Mitchell. "You'll straightforwardly report back to the station. Your actions today will be thoroughly reviewed. This kind of behavior won't be accepted on my watch." Mitchell nodded, his face ashen, then turned to get back towards his patrol car. It was a long one. Each stride weighted with the weight of his deeds. As the tension in the park started to release, Chief Mitchell inhaled deeply, then turned once again to Henry. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson. I'll make sure that Officer Mitchell answers for what he has done." Henry nodded a little to indicate, "Thank you, Chief." His voice is modest but honest. Mitchell, still severely disturbed by what had happened, recognized this episode was more than just a young officer's one mistake, symptomatic of a more general problem, one that cannot be disregarded. "This is not only about today, Miss Mitchell," stated, his voice careful. "We should change our behavior toward the community. Too much mistrust results from too many presumptions being made." Henry glanced at the chief, his face thoughtful and understanding. "It's been that way for a long period, but that does not mean it cannot change." The chief nodded in agreement. His mind immediately whirled to the actions required here. This was not only a question of disciplinizing one officer focused on addressing the underlying problems running through the incident of today, would not be thrown under the rug. Rather, it would act as a reminder of the necessary conversation's impetus. Talks on justice about respect and on how the police and society may re-establish confidence. Officer. After his encounter with Henry, Mitchell went back to the station, his cheeks still flushed and unclear of what was ahead. From the public censure he knew would follow from his actions, Swift Chief Mitchell would be suspended. Faithful to his pledge started an instant inquiry into Daniel's behavior. Clearly, such behavior would not be accepted in the department. The message was strong. None even. Those sporting a badge would be exempt from responsibility. Mitchell was taken from duty, waiting for the result of the inquiry aimed at deciding his future with the force in the next days that would find Mitchell in. Thinking back on his meeting with Henry, he had acted based on presumptions driven by prejudices he hadn't entirely admitted. Before he could easily discount someone like Henry depending just on his appearance and presence in the park. Now in the aftermath, the weight of his actions was seeping in as the Mitchell's investigation progressed, and he was obliged to complete community service and sensitivity training as part of the forced time away from his responsibilities gave him time to face the damage he had done not only to Henry, but also for the greater community his metamorphosis had started. Though the road ahead was unknown, the gaps in his perspective were beginning to manifest, and the results of his activities tormented him. For Henry, the happenings in the park awakened recollections of a past not too far from his mind. Usually returned to his early years, to a period when defending his rights meant jeopardizing everything. Born in the 1940s, Henry, having grown up during a time of intense racial separation, the struggles he had experienced as a young man were woven throughout his life and helped to shape his calm resilience today. Took with him, he had been involved in the civil rights movement, marching in demonstrations and planning community meetings. Henry has seen the best and worst of humanity, and still his conviction in justice had never wavered. One specific recollection sometimes returning in 1965, Henry had organized a nonviolent demonstration in his village for equal access to public areas. Back then, parks like Oakwood had been off limits to black people, assigned just for. Along with other activists, whites, Henry had stayed strong against the police lines encountered, not that different from what he had seen with Mitchell. Despite the threats and the violence they encountered, they had been successful in desegregating those parks so they could be used by everyone, because was a fight fought with dignity, much as the one he now experienced decades later. Oakwood Park itself was a creation of various initiatives where people from many spheres of life might gather. Henry had assisted in its planning for a place where families might assemble and children could play unhindered. Without the shadow of prejudice, Park had come to represent the development they had achieved, but events like the one Officer Mitchell reminded him that although Henry was the fight was not over. Work still had to be done. Stranger to endurance, as word of the event swiftly brought the community together. Henry had long been a respected person, and what had transpired at Oakwood Park set off a tsunami of years of knowing Henry, helped those who had known him come forward to tell tales of his local service. On social media, his compassion and relentless dedication to justice buzzed with indignation, not only at Officer Daniel's activities at the more general level of racial profiling still afflicting their community. Demonstrations sprang in front before the police station, arranged by local protesters demanding reform, placards bearing justice. As individuals demanded for Henry and racial profiling permeated the streets, increased law enforcement responsibility helped the momentum to grow, with more and more people supporting the cause. Center stage featured debates on the necessity of improved police force training for more empathy. This was not only about one officer's error, but also about a system long neglecting the rights and interests of individuals like Henry. Chief Mitchell saw the reaction of the society and realized that action had to be done outside of just answer to the cries. He started building the foundation for a community-wide project meant to mend relationships. The objective was to establish confidence between the public and law enforcement, so fostering communication and to handle the ingrained problems causing events like the one involving Mitchell. The Plan will feature frequent town hall meetings, open venues where people could openly express their worries too. Racial sensitivity and de-escalation were the emphasis of police training courses. Mitchell was determined to make sure that events at Oakwood Park would spur on long-lasting transformation. Though he had never asked for attention for, Henry found himself in the forefront of these initiatives in the next weeks. His self had grown to be a potent emblem of hope and fortitude. People turned to him as a model of how to oppose injustice with grace and tenacity. He spoke at community gatherings whereby he shares his experiences and exhorts others to remain vigilant in the struggle for equality. Many of the younger generation had not experienced the hardships of the civil rights movement. Thus, words really spoke to them. Rights movement, though at first they didn't realize its significance given the pain and attention of what had happened, there was a rising optimism. The community, once split by mistrust, was. People of different races and backgrounds started to gather in solidarity, side by side, united in their call. Henry's deeds for a brighter future have motivated many to stand up to, start to participate more in their local communities and advocate changes that will help everyone. Chief Mitchell's effort acquired momentum, and gradually, but definitely, the gap separating the police from the public started to. Though in the big scope of things it was a minor step, narrow, it was yet a step forward with each. The hope for real's permanent transformation became more potent. Henry's calm strength had started a movement that would carry on long after the Oakwood Park event had happened. Disappeared from the headlines, Henry realized the road ahead would not be simple. Though there would be more difficulties to conquer, he had never been one to avoid the struggle for justice. He had observed change occurring before and thought the community might mobilize once more. Most significantly, voices had been heard, and most people started to feel that a fairer society was achievable. And so, as the sun sank over Oakwood Park, creating long shadows across the familiar ground, pathways there carried a sense of rejuvenation. The tension gave way to togetherness, and Henry stood at the heart of it all, understood that this was only the start of change, and this time seemed like it would just last. Following weeks of suspension and required retraining, Officer Mitchell was struggling with the truth of what had happened. His first defensiveness had faded, replaced by a thorough, unpleasant contemplation on his activities at Oakwood Park. The sensitivity training courses he was obliged to attend made him face prejudices he had long neglected. Started to see the weight of his choices that day, not only in terms of professional behavior, but also in the damage he had personally caused. It was not only about following the law, it was about knowing the people he was pledged to defend over time. And with reflection, Mitchell contacted Chief Mitchell, asked to speak with Henry. It was difficult to approach the man. He made mistakes, but Mitchell understood it was vital when the day came. Arrived at the conference humble, not sure what to expect, but resolved to correct things. Henry, ever the epitome of peace and decency, sat across from him, his look unreadable, but not nasty. Mitchell took a Mr. Thompson, I wanted to apologize. I know what deep breath and calm speech entail. I'm really sorry for how I handled you. I did wrong and missed you for who you are, and that's on me. His voice wavers just slightly, but there was honesty in his words. I realize it's not sufficient to just apologize. I want to improve, not only for the community I wish to participate in, but also for myself, if you would let me. Henry listened carefully as his wise eyes examined Daniel's face as Mitchell completed. Henry nodded slowly. I value your apology, Officer Mitchell. Admitting mistakes takes bravery. Even more so is asking for forgiveness, but recognize this isn't just about you and me. This relates to something far more significant. Henry's voice remained consistent, but his statements revealed great insight. Change is necessary, and it will take time and work. Mitchell, it will take more than one apology. You need to be part of that transformation. Nodded, knowing the challenge before him. He realized his path for redemption was not only about repairing his friendship with Henry, but more in line with helping to overhaul the system. Henry's acceptance was an opportunity to do better, not a pass. And for Mitchell, it was a lifeline toward realizing the cop he had always dreamed of being. In the months following the Incident Henry's involvement in the society only developed from what had begun as a fight for his personal rights into something far bigger. Younger generations started looking to him for direction, eager to grow from someone who had experienced the successes and challenges of the civil rights movement Henry, ever the humble leader, had gone through. Under his direction, these young activists are learning the value of tenacity in pursuing justice, not under angry, but with dignity and conviction. His front porch turned to become a gathering spot for civic rights, systematic disparity, and the park community will play in determining the direction young people will travel. People came to him with inquiries and suggestions of frustration. Henry listened to every one of them, providing guidance. Based on decades of expertise, he developed into a mentor to many, making sure the past would not repeat again. Lost on the future, his impact reached beyond Oakwood Park, turning into a lighthouse of knowledge and hope for the whole community. Henry's voice bore historical weight, but his message was always forward-looking. We cannot linger on what has been done to us. He regularly advised the younger campaigners to investigate how can we apply what we know to improve not only for ourselves but also for others. Following us, his mentoring ingrained in the next generation a sense of accountability to guarantee that the struggle for justice would go on long after his death. The change of Oakwood Park, possibly the most obvious indication of the community's mending and unity, was the same park that had been the scene of confrontation, now a representation of what might be attained when people gathered together. One of the park walls was painted in a mural showing Henry standing tall, surrounded by scenes of civil rights marches and community events. The mural turned to become a daily reminder of their advancement. Long-term reforms under Chief Mitchell's direction were carried out within the framework, and the work remaining ahead was police force. Community policing initiatives were launched to improve relationships between police and the people they served. The town scheduled frequent forums where people might talk directly with law enforcement to establish a conversation not unlike from past times, not only regarding policies. It aimed at restoring confidence, one interaction at a time. As the park grew, so did the bonds among the people living in the village, who had earlier kept to themselves, now expressed clearly regarding their aspirations for the area. They wished to see actual, long-lasting change in. Years of knowing each other brought families together to help one another understand that the strength of once only a location for morning walks, Unity Oakwood Park lay in the community. And coffee had evolved into a living representation of what was achievable when people stood up for what was right. At last, the narrative of Henry Thompson and Officer Mitchell became evidence of the more than just a story of confrontation, not only a tribute to development in power of redemption and Henry's ongoing struggle for justice. Quiet strength has started a movement reminding everyone that change always within reach of whatever speed. People were ready to defend it as the sun sank over Oakwood Park, throwing long shadows across the painting of. It was abundantly evident that the narrative was far from finished. Henry had showed someone who is tenacious in the face of hardship could motivate a whole community to have faith in something better. His legacy beyond the mural to the hearts of the people he had touched, his acts had proved that change was not only feasible but also natural, even in the most demanding situations. The last lesson was straightforward but important, since the fight for justice never really finishes, but is continued on by every generation. Henry Thompson had handed the batons, and the community, motivated by his example, prepared one to keep on the path towards a more fair and equal future. Disclaimer: this channel stands against all forms of intolerance, discrimination, racism, and violations of human rights. The stories shared here are original creations, developed to encourage reflection, understanding, and constructive dialogue. All content is produced with a commitment to respecting diversity and honoring human dignity.